Welcome to Ian Cinema, your destination for endless entertainment and unforgettable movie moments. Discover exciting films, inspiring stories, and cinematic journeys across every genre. Whether you love action, drama, thrillers, or timeless favorites, there's always something waiting for you here. Sit back, enjoy the experience, and let Ian Cinema bring the magic of movies to your screen. Patton is a 1970 American epic biographical war film that tells the story of U.S. General George S. Patton during World War II. The film stars George C. Scott in the title role, with Carl Malden portraying General Omar Bradley. It was directed by Franklin J. Schaffner and written by Francis Ford Coppola and Edmund H. North. The screenplay is based on Patton, Ordeal and Triumph by Ladislas Farrago and Bradley's memoir, A Soldier's Story. The film premiered in New York City on February 4, 1970, and was released nationwide by 20th Century Fox on April 2, 1970. Produced on a budget of $12 million, Patton became a major box office success, earning approximately $61.7 million worldwide. Critically acclaimed, the film won 7 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Director, and Best Original Screenplay. George C. Scott won the Academy Award for Best Actor for his unforgettable portrayal of General Patton, although he famously declined the honor. One of the film's most iconic moments is its powerful opening monologue, with Patton standing before a massive American flag, a scene that remains one of the most recognizable and frequently quoted in cinema history. In 2003, Patton was selected for preservation in the United States National Film Registry by the Library of Congress for its cultural, historical, and artistic significance. That same year, the Academy Film Archive also preserved the film. The story begins during World War II. After the U.S. Corps suffers a devastating defeat at the Battle of Kasserine Pass in North Africa. Determined to restore morale and effectiveness, General George S. Patton is appointed to take command. He quickly reorganizes the troops, enforces strict discipline, and transforms the struggling force into a capable fighting unit. As the Allied campaign continues, Patton grows increasingly frustrated with British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, believing that Montgomery receives most of the recognition for the Allied victories, while Montgomery's forces pursue Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's army and ease pressure on the Americans after Kasserine Pass. Patton leads the U.S. Corps to redemption with a decisive victory at the Battle of El Getter. Following the Allied triumph in North Africa, Patton and Montgomery present competing strategies for the next phase of the war, setting the stage for further rivalry as the Allies prepare for the invasion of Europe. During the Allied invasion of Sicily, General Patton recommends landing the U.S. 7th Army near Palermo. However, the overall commander, Harold Alexander, chooses to follow General Montgomery's more cautious strategy, ordering Patton's forces to land at Gela instead. Although Patton is initially assigned a supporting role, he quickly launches an aggressive advance toward northwestern Sicily, capturing Palermo before racing to Messina ahead of the British forces. While the campaign is underway, Patton visits a military field hospital and slaps a soldier he believes is suffering from cowardice rather than battle fatigue. The incident sparks widespread public outrage, forcing him to issue a formal apology. As preparations begin for the Allied invasion of France, General Eisenhower removes Patton from frontline command. Instead, he places him in charge of the fictional 1st United States Army Group in England, a carefully planned deception designed to convince the Germans that the main invasion would occur at a different location. During a public event in Knutsford, England, Patton remarks that the post-war world will be dominated by the British and Americans. His outspoken comments alarm Allied leaders, prompting General George Marshall to consider whether Patton should be relieved of duty and sent home in disgrace. A few weeks after the Normandy landings, Patton returns to active combat as commander of the U.S. Third Army, now serving under his former subordinate, General Omar Bradley. Under Patton's bold leadership, the Third Army rapidly advances across France. However, its momentum is eventually halted because fuel and supplies are redirected to support Montgomery's forces. Frustrated by the delay, Patton confronts Bradley, who once again warns him that his habit of speaking too openly could seriously damage his career. During the Battle of the Bulge, Patton and his staff execute a daring plan to relieve the surrounded 101st Airborne Division of Bastogne, achieving one of the campaign's most celebrated successes. After Germany surrenders, Patton's blunt comparisons between certain American political policies of Nazism create another major controversy. As a result, he is removed from command of the Third Army but remains in Germany to assist with the Allied occupation. In the film's closing scene, Patton narrowly escapes a fatal accident while walking with his beloved bull terrier. As the story concludes, his voiceover reflects on the temporary nature of fame and military glory. He recalls how, for more than 1,000 years, victorious Roman generals celebrated triumphs with magnificent parades. These processions featured trumpeters, musicians, exotic animals from conquered lands, wagons filled with treasure and captured weapons, and defeated prisoners marching in chains. The victorious commander rode through the city in a grand chariot, sometimes accompanied by children dressed in white, reminding audiences that even the greatest military achievements eventually fade with time. Attempts to produce a film about General Patton began soon after his death in 1945. However, his widow, Beatrice Patton, strongly opposed the project. After her death in 1953, producer Frank McCarthy revived the idea. The day after Beatrice's funeral, the filmmakers approached the Patton family, requesting access to the general's personal diaries and seeking assistance from family members during production. The family declined to participate. McCarthy also requested support from the Pentagon, but military officials initially refused to cooperate. One reason was that Patton's son, George Patton IV, was still serving in the U.S. Army, while his daughter Ruth was married to an active duty officer. After several years of negotiations, McCarthy finally secured the Army's cooperation in 1959, allowing the production to move forward. 20th Century Fox acquired the film rights to A Soldier's Story, the 1951 autobiography of General of the Army Omar Bradley, who plays a major role in the film and is portrayed by Carl Malden. In 1963, Francis Ford Coppola wrote the screenplay, drawing heavily from Ladislas Farrago's biography Patton, Ordeal and Triumph, as well as Bradley's memoir. Screenwriter Edmund H. North later joined the project to help refine the script. The film was originally titled Blood and Guts, and acclaimed director William Wyler was initially chosen to direct. However, Wyler left the project before production was scheduled to begin in January 1969. After the death of Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1969, Omar Bradley became the only surviving five-star general in the United States. He served as a consultant on the film, although the extent of his influence over the final screenplay remains uncertain. While Bradley had known George S. Patton personally, the two generals had very different personalities, and many historians believe Bradley disliked Patton. Because Patton's personal diaries were unavailable during production, the filmmakers relied largely on Bradley's recollections and the memories of other military leaders to recreate Patton's thoughts, decisions, and motivations. Military historian Brigadier General S. L. A. Marshall, who had known both Patton and Bradley, later criticized the film's portrayal. He argued that Bradley's influence was clearly visible and described the movie's version of Patton as a victorious but glory-seeking figure. Marshall believed that the real Patton was far more complex and mysterious than the film suggested. He also referenced Napoleon's famous observation that the greatest skill of a general lies not only in strategy but in understanding and shaping human nature, suggesting that producer Frank McCarthy and Bradley may have intended to emphasize that idea. Filming officially began on February 3, 1969, and took place at 71 different locations across 6 countries. Most of the production was based in Spain, where large quantities of surplus World War II military equipment from the U.S. Army were available. Spain's long-standing currency restrictions also allowed American studios to recover profits earned from earlier film releases, while the country's lower production costs and affordable labor made it an attractive filming destination. One memorable sequence, in which Patton drives through what is meant to represent the ancient city of Carthage, was actually filmed at the Roman archaeological site of Volubilis in Morocco. The early scene featuring Patton and King Mohammed V reviewing Moroccan troops, including the famous Gomers, was filmed at the Royal Palace in Rabat. An unannounced nighttime battle sequence was also filmed nearby, causing alarm among residents living close to the Royal Palace. During the filming, a paratrooper was tragically electrocuted after coming into contact with power lines. None of the footage from that accident was included in the final film. The scene showing the dedication ceremony at the Welcome Centre in Knutsford, Cheshire, England, was filmed at the actual location. Sequences set in Tunisia and Sicily were shot in Almería, southern Spain, while Pamplona doubled for locations in France and Germany. The winter scenes, including the Battle of the Bulge, were filmed near Segovia after the production team rushed there upon learning that fresh snowfall had created ideal conditions. Interior scenes were completed in Seville. Cinematographer Fred J. Hohenkamp filmed Patton in the 65mm Dimension 150 format, making it only the second feature film to use the format after the Bible. In the beginning, 1966, a significant amount of battle footage was ultimately removed from the final cut, but it did not go to waste. Many of the unused combat scenes were later reused in the 1972 made-for-television film Fireball Forward, which was also produced by Frank McCarthy. Edmund H. North wrote the screenplay for that production, and Patton cast member Morgan Paul also appeared in the film. Patton opens with George C. Scott delivering the general's famous speech before the Third Army while standing in front of a massive American flag. To avoid receiving an R rating, Coppola and North softened much of Patton's original language throughout the screenplay. In the opening speech, for example, the word fornicating replaced one of Patton's stronger expressions while criticizing the Saturday Evening Post. Scott's deep, gravelly voice also differed greatly from Patton's real voice, which was high-pitched, nasal, and somewhat squeaky, a difference noted by historian S. L. A. Marshall. At the same time, Marshall argued that the film exaggerated Patton's use of profanity, explaining that the real general was not constantly foul-mouthed and only used harsh language when he believed it would make a stronger impression. When George C. Scott learned that the speech would appear at the beginning of the film, he initially refused to perform it because he feared it would overshadow the rest of his performance. Director Franklin J. Schaffner reassured him by saying it would be placed at the end of the movie. Once filming was complete, however, Schaffner decided that it worked far better as the opening scene. The iconic sequence was filmed in a single afternoon at Sevilla Studios in Madrid, with the enormous American flag painted directly onto the studio's back wall. Every medal and decoration seen on Patton's uniform during the opening speech was an accurate replica of the honors that General George S. Patton had actually received during his military career. Although General George S. Patton earned many military decorations, he rarely wore all of his medals in public. In fact, he was not yet a four-star general when he delivered the famous speeches that inspired the film's opening scene. The only known occasion when he wore every medal was in the backyard of his Virginia home, where his wife asked him to pose for a photograph wearing his complete collection of awards. The filmmakers used a copy of that photograph as a reference to faithfully recreate Patton's iconic appearance in the film's opening sequence. The film's critically acclaimed musical score was composed and conducted by Jerry Goldsmith and performed by the Hollywood Studio Symphony. Goldsmith introduced several innovative techniques to connect the music with the story. One of the most memorable was the use of an echoplex to create echoing trumpet triplets, inspired by the military bugle call to war. These haunting echoes symbolized General Patton's belief in reincarnation. The main theme also blended a powerful symphonic march with the rich sound of a pipe organ. reflecting Patton's commanding military presence while highlighting his deeply religious character. Goldsmith's outstanding score earned an Academy Award nomination for Best Original Score and was later recognized as one of the American Film Institute's 250 nominees. John Gillett of the Monthly Film Bulletin offered a more favorable assessment. He noted that the film clearly enjoys portraying Patton's larger-than-life personality while still exposing the deep prejudices and flaws beneath the surface. Gillett also believed the filmmakers made the perfect casting choice. Karl Malden delivers a thoughtful and restrained performance as General Omar Bradley, while the actors portraying the German commanders are equally convincing. However, George C. Scott's commanding performance overshadows everyone else in the cast. Film critic James Berardinelli has described Patton as his favorite movie of all time and continues to regard it as one of Hollywood's greatest biographical war films. According to Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein's book The Final Days, Patton was also President Richard Nixon's favorite film. Nixon first watched it with his family during a private screening at the White House Family Theater on April 5, 1970. He soon became fascinated by the film, watching it repeatedly with Henry Kissinger over the following weeks. Nixon screened it several more times at the White House and even during a cruise aboard the presidential yacht USS Sequoia on the Potomac River. Kissinger later joked about Nixon's determination to have him watch the movie again during the cruise, writing that it was the second time he had so honored me. Although he acknowledged the film's inspirational qualities, Kissinger admitted that he slipped away for about an hour to prepare for the next day's National Security Council meeting. Today, Patton holds a 90% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes based on 52 reviews, with an average score of 8.4 out of 10. The site's critical consensus states, George C. Scott's sympathetic yet uncompromising portrayal of the legendary general anchors this sweeping epic with one of the finest performances ever seen in an American biographical film. On Metacritic, the film has a score of 86 out of 100 based on reviews from 20 critics, indicating universal acclaim. At the 43rd Academy Awards in 1971, Patton received 10 Oscar nominations and won 7 awards, including Best Picture. George C. Scott won the Academy Award for Best Actor but famously refused to accept it, saying he disliked both the voting process and the idea of actors competing against one another. He became the first actor ever to decline an Oscar. Producer Frank McCarthy accepted the award on his behalf, and the Best Picture Oscar is now displayed at the George C. Marshall Museum at the Virginia Military Institute. When I was younger, I had a strong prejudice against older films. Even though Patton was released in 1970, I lumped it together with movies that seemed outdated simply because I hadn't experienced them during their original theatrical run. I was only 3 years old when it was released. Watching Patton was one of the experiences that made me realize how unfair that attitude was. Lawrence of Arabia completely erased the remaining doubts. I had always imagined classic films to be slow, stiff, and dull, but these two masterpieces proved just how mistaken I had been. Lawrence of Arabia may well be the greatest historical film ever made, but Patton isn't far behind. While I consider Lawrence a stronger overall film, I believe Patton is the better biography because it remains more faithful to its subject. Lawrence of Arabia takes considerable dramatic liberties with historical facts, whereas Patton generally stays much closer to reality. George C. Scott's career-defining portrayal of General George S. Patton remains the foundation of the film's success. Although Scott enjoyed many outstanding roles before and after Patton, this is unquestionably the performance for which he is best remembered. He won and famously declined the Academy Award for Best Actor, delivering what many consider flawless performance. Scott completely disappears into the role, creating a deeply complex and convincing portrait of the famous general. His work stands not only among the greatest performances of 1970 but among the finest achievements in the history of cinema. It remains a benchmark against which many other acting performances are measured. Karl Malden is also excellent as General Omar Bradley. That said, I've always felt his portrayal is just a little too warm and gentle. It's difficult not to wonder whether that was influenced by the fact that the real Bradley served as a consultant on the film. This isn't to suggest Bradley wasn't genuinely a decent man, but it does seem possible that some of his rougher edges were softened because of his involvement. After all, filmmakers usually find it easier to be completely candid about historical figures who are no longer around to influence the production. Even so, Bradley's character serves an important purpose. He highlights Patton's weaknesses while demonstrating that effective military leadership can take very different forms. Bradley's calm, humble, and practical approach contrasts sharply with Patton's intense ambition, fiery personality, and oversized ego. That contrast makes Patton's strengths and flaws stand out even more clearly. Although Bradley may seem somewhat idealized, the characterization works well within the story. Director Franklin J. Schaffner approaches the material with confidence and restraint. His style isn't especially flashy, but he tells the story with clarity, efficiency, and very little unnecessary sentimentality. Some of the battle scenes, particularly an early engagement in North Africa, feel less exciting than they could have been. Fortunately, the film is much more interested in exploring character than showcasing combat, so this isn't a major weakness. While Schaffner doesn't present warfare with the raw intensity later achieved by Steven Spielberg in Saving Private Ryan, he also avoids excessive sentimentality and never feels the need to overstate his themes. His direction allows audiences to reach their own conclusions rather than forcing a particular viewpoint upon them. Although traces of the director's personal perspective occasionally appear, Patton remains surprisingly balanced and largely free of any obvious political or ideological agenda. It is a film that both supporters and critics of war can appreciate, each finding different meanings within the story. The film deliberately leaves Patton himself open to interpretation. Take the famous slapping incident, for example. Does it reveal a cruel and insensitive commander who viewed his soldiers as expendable tools in his pursuit of glory, or does it portray a fiercely driven leader whose unwavering sense of duty and discipline sometimes pushed him beyond acceptable limits? The film doesn't provide a definitive answer, and that's one of its greatest strengths. Neither interpretation is entirely right nor entirely wrong. Ultimately, the answer depends on how each viewer chooses to understand the man behind the legend. One issue that occurs repeatedly throughout the film is its inconsistent focus. Even so, more than 4 decades after its release, Patton remains a true cinematic classic, backed by outstanding production values and a remarkable lead performance. It stands as one of the finest war films ever made. This Blu-ray presents the film in its original aspect ratio of approximately 2.20 to 1. At first glance, the picture quality appears impressive, but a closer look reveals several shortcomings. The restoration team applied extremely aggressive noise reduction, removing nearly all of the original film grain. As a result, the image often looks unnaturally smooth and glossy, giving it an artificial, almost plastic appearance. This issue is immediately noticeable during the film's iconic opening sequence. As Patton steps in front of the massive American flag, GeorgeCScott appears almost superimposed onto the background, as though he had been digitally inserted. At times, the image even takes on a slightly cartoonish look, lacking the rich, film-like texture that should have been preserved. It's especially disappointing because many other aspects of the transfer show clear improvements. Sharpness is generally excellent, with only occasional moments of softness. A few wide shots appear slightly blurry, but these instances are rare and never become distracting. The transfer is also free of jagged edges, shimmering artifacts, and edge enhancement halos. Source damage has been cleaned up exceptionally well, making this the cleanest presentation the film has ever received. Color reproduction is pleasing, featuring a natural palette with vibrant yet realistic tones. Black levels are deep and stable, while low light scenes maintain solid detail and smooth contrast, and the excessive noise reduction not stripped away the film's natural texture. This could have been an outstanding presentation. Instead, The overly polished and plastic-like appearance prevents it from being a truly faithful representation of the original source. On the audio side, the DTS HD Master Audio 5.1 soundtrack performs remarkably well for a film released in 1970. The soundstage offers impressive width and depth, exceeding expectations for a movie of its age. The front three channels deliver particularly strong stereo imaging, with sound effects accurately positioned and smooth movement across the speakers. Dialogue is well localized, making conversations feel natural and clearly placed within the sound field. The surround channels are used sparingly but effectively. Rather than delivering constant activity, they provide subtle ambient effects that enhance the atmosphere without becoming distracting. This restrained approach works well, especially since the front soundstage remains rich, detailed, and engaging throughout the film. Overall audio quality is very respectable. Dialogue occasionally sounds slightly harsh around the edges, but it remains clear, intelligible, and reasonably natural. Sound effects, including explosions and gunfire, sometimes exhibit a small amount of distortion, though these moments are minor and never become a significant issue. Meanwhile, Jerry Goldsmith's memorable score is reproduced cleanly, with smooth dynamics and excellent musical presence. Considering the film's age, the overall sound mix is highly satisfying. Compared to the 2006 DVD release, this Blu-ray offers noticeable improvements. The audio is fuller, more dynamic, and more immersive, while the visuals are sharper and more vibrant. Although the heavy use of noise reduction prevents the picture from reaching its full potential, it still surpasses the older DVD, which appeared flatter, softer, and less detailed. While the Blu-ray's image quality is far from perfect, it remains the superior version overall. The Blu-ray also carries over all of the bonus features from the 2006 DVD edition. Disc 1 includes a brief introduction by screenwriter Francis Ford Coppola, running approximately 4 minutes and 54 seconds. In this feature, he discusses the challenges of writing the character of Patton, the research he conducted, the creative decisions he made, the reasons he was removed from the project, and how the film's eventual success helped advance his career. It serves as an enjoyable and informative introduction to the movie. The next bonus feature is a behind-the-scenes gallery accompanied by an audio essay on the historical George S. Patton, running for 53 minutes and 15 seconds. It features commentary from Patton historian Charles M. Province, founder of the Patton Historical Society. Province's insights are both informative and engaging. He provides a wealth of historical details that the film doesn't cover, particularly Patton's life before World War II. He also explains several events portrayed in the movie, separating historical fact from cinematic interpretation. Interestingly, the film proves to be remarkably accurate in most cases. Although Province likely worked from prepared notes, his delivery feels natural rather than scripted, giving the commentary a relaxed, conversational tone. His observations offer valuable historical perspective and leave viewers wanting to learn even more about Patton through a full biography. The disc concludes with the film's original theatrical trailer and also opens with a preview for Jumper. Compared to the original 1999 DVD release, however, the Blu-ray loses several bonus features, including 4 radio advertisements and a selection of alternate Jerry Goldsmith musical cues. Also missing are the authentic newsreel clips of the real General Patton that appeared on the original widescreen Laserdisc release, though they were absent from the 1997 reissue as well. It's disappointing that these fascinating historical clips were once again left out. Even so, Patton remains one of the greatest war films ever made and fully deserves the respect it has earned over the decades. It tells its story with confidence and benefits from outstanding performances, excellent filmmaking, and compelling historical drama, while the Blu-ray offers strong audio quality and worthwhile bonus features. Its presentation is held back by excessive digital noise reduction, which gives the image an overly polished, artificial appearance. That's unfortunate because a film of this caliber deserves a much better visual presentation. I love it. God help me, I do love it. I love it more than my life. Those unforgettable words, spoken by General George S. Patton Jr. about Warren Patton, foreshadow one of cinema's most famous military speeches, Lieutenant Colonel Kilgore's iconic line, "I love the smell of napalm in the morning." From Apocalypse Now, the connection is hardly surprising, as both screenplays were co-written by Francis Ford Coppola. In many ways, Kilgore feels like an exaggerated spiritual successor to Patton, a larger-than-life soldier who embraces war with unsettling enthusiasm. By the end of World War II, Patton reflects, all good things must come to an end. In his own mind, he exists beyond ordinary history. Standing on the North African battlefield where Rome defeated Carthage, he declares, "I was here," genuinely believing that he fought there in a previous life. His faith in reincarnation and destiny shapes his identity as much as his military achievements. When he is sidelined before the Allied invasion of Europe, Patton fumes that the greatest opportunity of his lifetime has been taken away from him. He simply refuses to believe fate or God would allow such a thing to happen. That unwavering confidence is both his greatest strength and his greatest weakness. It inspires extraordinary courage in his troops while repeatedly getting him into trouble. Patton was an exceptional battlefield strategist, yet his impulsive nature often overshadowed his brilliance. During a war in which millions suffered unimaginable horrors, it was the infamous incident in which he slapped a shell-shocked soldier that seriously damaged his military career. Released in 1970, at the height of the deeply unpopular Vietnam War, Franklin J. Schaffner's Patton was interpreted by some critics as an anti-war film. In reality, it is anything but. Instead, it celebrates the military ideal through the portrait of a deeply flawed but undeniably extraordinary commander. Patton's eccentricities and larger-than-life personality made him an awkward figure in peacetime, but on the battlefield they became powerful assets. In this respect, Patton shares similarities with Winston Churchill. Both men relied on flamboyance, eccentric behavior, and masterful self-promotion to inspire their followers while confusing their opponents. The film never hides Patton's eccentricities or even hints at madness, but it also makes clear that his military successes frequently overshadowed, and sometimes embarrassed, his far more cautious British counterpart, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. Running nearly 3 hours, Patton belongs almost entirely to George C. Scott. Outside of the battle sequences and occasional scenes showing German commanders constantly trying to predict Patton's next move, Scott dominates nearly every frame. His performance ranks among the greatest in film history, perfectly merging the actor's own commanding personality with that of the legendary general. Although the role was reportedly offered to several major stars including Burt Lancaster, Rod Steiger, Lee Marvin, Robert Mitchum, and John Wayne, it's impossible to imagine anyone other than Scott playing Patton. His earlier performance as the wildly eccentric General Buck Turgidson in Dr. Strangelove already hinted at the manic energy and anti-Soviet attitude that would later define his portrayal of Patton. George C. Scott, 1927–1999, was a powerful, intensely private, and exceptionally gifted actor. Known as a perfectionist, he stood apart from the Hollywood establishment and famously refused to attend the Academy Awards. Throughout his career, he pursued demanding roles in the works of Shakespeare, Eugene O'Neill, and Arthur Miller with the same relentless drive that Patton devoted to warfare. Like Patton himself, Scott seemed to need a great challenge to give his life purpose. One memorable scene captures Patton being dressed by his aide, who carefully places his helmet on his head almost as though crowning a king. Looking into the mirror, Patton quietly reflects, "All my life I've wanted to lead a great army in a desperate battle." The moment feels less like a military ritual and more like an actor preparing to step onto a stage. After one of Patton's dramatic speeches, a subordinate remarks, "General, the men don't always know when you're acting." "They don't need to know," Patton replies, "only I need to know." The exchange perfectly captures his understanding of leadership. Patton recognized that commanding an army required performance as much as strategy. Newspapers and newsreels often reduced entire military campaigns to the names of their general. Sir Rommel in North Africa, Patton racing across Francia, and Patton embraced that mythology completely. When he vows to liberate a city before Montgomery reaches it, he speaks entirely in the first person. To Patton, his soldiers, tanks, and equipment are extensions of his own will. General Omar Bradley, portrayed with quiet restraint by Carl Malden, struggles to accept the risks Patton willingly takes because he views war through a more conventional lens. Patton, by contrast, sees his army as an extension of himself. Bradley jokes that if Patton were suddenly appointed admiral of the Turkish Navy, his aides could somehow produce the appropriate medals from their packs. It's a witty observation that perfectly captures Patton's obsession with image, ceremony, and personal glory. Ultimately, Patton is less a traditional war movie than a fascinating character study of a man who found his true purpose in combat. George C. Scott's commanding performance is nothing short of electrifying. As Patton, he constantly stands upright in his jeep, delivers stirring speeches, seeks the spotlight, rushes into danger to rally his troops, and even directs traffic on the battlefield. There's an almost manic energy to everything he does. The film reveals almost nothing about Patton's family, children, or personal relationships. He appears to exist solely for war. His deepest conversations are not with loved ones but with himself, reinforcing the idea that the greatest battle Patton ever fought may have been the one within his own mind. He seems formidably well-read, lecturing all his subordinates on the history of the battlefields, the lessons of Napoleon, and the experiences of earlier leaders who came this way. He has a classical quotation for every occasion. "You son of a," he gloats after outsmarting a Rommel. "I read your book." Scott's performance is not one level. To portrays a many-layered man who desires to appear one level. Instead of adding tiresome behavioral touches, he allows us small glimpses of what may be going on inside. Having made a fetish of bravery, he obtains a dog that is terrified most of the time and affectionately drags the cowardly beast wherever he goes. Told by the press that the American public is fascinated by his pearl-handled revolver, he stone-faced as ivory. Only a pimp from a cheap New Orleans WH house would carry a pearl-handled revolver. That shows has given it some thought. Early in the film, under surprise air attack by the Nazis, he stands in the middle of a street firing at them with a revolver. Crazy? Yes, but it adds to the legend. The most famous scene is the first one. Patton mounting a stage to dress his troops from in front of an American flagger that fills the huge 70mm screen. His speech is unapologetically bloodthirsty. "We will cut out their living guts and use them to grease the treads of our tanks." His uniform and decorations, ribbons and medals, jodhpurs and riding boots and swagger stick fall just a hair short of what Groucho Marx might have worn. Scott's great nose could be the beak of an American eagle. The closing shot is the other side of the coin. A graying and lonely old man walking his dog. Even then, we suspect Patton is acting. But does he know it? Franklin O'Shaner (1920–1989) was a master of bold uncluttered canvases. After started directing live television in the 1950s, he made dramas, including The Best Man, one of the best Hollywood films about politics. Before finding his natural footing with epics such as The Warlord in 1965, Planet of the Apes 1968, and after Patton, Nicholas and Alexandra, 1971, and Papillon 1973. His Patton is one of the most uncluttered of war movies. Devoid of facile plots, colorful supporting characters, and human interest. There are no individual soldiers whose adventures we follow, and the battle scenes are seen in long shot, no depersonalized. They have the sweep of Victorian canvases instead of the hand-to-hand intimacy of platoon. Saving a Private Ryan or We Were Soldiers. Even the Bradley character has no purpose other than to admonish, support, and puzzle over Patton. to stand there and to look at him. The movie sees the war also Patton saw it as Patton's story. Well, it's one way of looking at it. Footnote. I see the war most vividly through the eyes of an old friend, the director Rusimir, who enlisted at 17 and believed with Patton it was the best thing that had ever happened to him. Over the years, he has talked about it endlessly, and I have a glimpse of Patton from Meyer in the closing days of the war, when Meyer was a signal corps cameraman near the German lines in France. He was rooted from his bed in the middle of the night and ordered to join an unauthorized route behind enemy lines to be led by Patton. The general had become convinced Hitler was making a secret visit to the front and planned to capture him personally. We drove off into the night. Murray recalls, Hitler wasn't there. We returned and were warned to keep quiet about it. That was Patton for you. There is a moment early in Patton when GeorgeCScott stands alone on a North African battlefield the morning after the fighting has ended. The dead area everywhere. He surveys the carnage with a something that is not quite horror and not quite satisfaction, but something uncomfortably close to joy. He quotes Plutarch, he is in that moment exactly what the film has been telling us. He is a man who was born in the wrong century and knows it and has never fully forgiven the world for that fact. That scene tells you more about General George S. Patton Jr. than any biography written about him, and it takes about 45 seconds. Franklin J. Schaffner directed this film with complete assurance, and Francis Ford Coppola and Edmund H. North wrote it without a wasted scene. Neither of them tells you what to think, they just show you the man and step back. The film opens famously with Patton addressing his troops and us in front of an American flag so enormous it fills the entire screen. He's in full dress uniform, ribbons and medals stacked to his chin, pearl-handled revolvers at each hip. He tells us that Americans love a winner and will not tolerate a loser. He uses language that was startling for 1970 and remains bracing today. The speech runs 6 minutes and there is not a frame of it to spare. By the time he finishes, we know the man. The rest of the film, all 2 hours and 52 minutes of it, is the proof of what we have been told. The story follows Patton through the North African campaign of 1943, through Sicily, through the run across France, through the Battle of the Bulge, and into Germany. It is the story of only of the most brilliant and most difficult military commanders in American history. A man whose genius for armored warfare was matched only by his genius for making powerful enemies. He slaps a hospitalized soldier he accuses of cowardice and loses command of his army. He gives a speech implying that post-war governance should belong to the Americans and the British and not the Russians, and is removed from command again. He wins battles that his superiors would have been content to let it grind on for months. He is, depending on who is watching him, a monster or a hero or both simultaneously. Scott's performance is one of the greater ones. He refused the Academy Award for Best Actor on principle, he said, opposing the competitive nature of awards, and the Academy gave it to him anyway. Right call. What Scott does here is not impersonate Patton or channel him in the way actors talk about their process. He just becomes him. There is no visible effort, no moment where you will catch him working. The performance also no seams. He simply is the man. Carla Malden plays General Omar Bradley with a quietness that earns its own respect. Bradley is the man who admires Patton, understands him, and keeps getting handed the wreckage. Malden is so steady in the role that his scenes with Scott turn into something you do not expect from a war film. Two men who genuinely like each other, deeply at odds about what the job actually demands. Neither one wins those arguments. What makes a Patton endures not the battle sequences, impressive as they are. It is the question the film refuses to answer. Is this man admirable? He wins wars. He drives his soldiers past the point of human endurance and asks them to be grateful for it. He believes in a reincarnation and is entirely serious about it. He is vain, devout, brilliant, and occasionally monstrous. The film presents all of this without judgment and without the comfort of a verdict. Richard Nixon watched Tito repeatedly in the White House. A reportedly transfixed, whether he was inspired or warned is a question the film deliberately leaves open. That is why it still matters. We keep having the same argument about what do we want from the people who lead us, whether results justify the damage, whether brilliance excuses cruelty, whether a man who wins by breaking every rule deserves the win. Patton does not settle that argument, it just puts the most extreme version of it on screen and runs it for nearly 3 hours. Richard Nixon watched it over and over at the White House, sometimes dragging a Kissinger along. Nobody has ever fully explained what Nixon thought he was learning. That ambiguity is the film's greatest achievement. 55 years on, it still has not resolved. In early 1971, the Academy Awards saluted Patton, capturing 8 Oscars, including Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Screenplay, Best Editing, and Best Production Design. The movie won every major battle of the evening. Such acclaim was richly deserved, for Patton remains to this day one of Hollywood's most compelling biographical war pictures, with its larger-than-life yet at the same time singularly human portrayal of George S. Patton Jr. Franklin Schaffner's picture is an example of filmmaking at its finest. From production design and battle choreography to simple one-on-one dramatic acting, Patton has it all. There is no scene in all 170 minutes that doesn't work on some level. Patton was not a friendly, easygoing person, a war hero and a keen strategist. He was also harsh, stubborn to the point of intransigence, and undiplomatic. Aside from the campaigns he waged in the North, framing the quieter, more personal moments. The last shot of the film with Patton walking his dog across a snow-spotted field in Bavaria blends the best of both these intimate and panoramic views. Jerry Goldsmith's fine and immediately recognizable scar complements Cohen-Camp's cinematography. Those who have not seen Patton or will have not watched the film carefully might assume that this movie is about a World War II and one of its most celebrated generals. In fact, they would be only partially correct. What Patton sets out to do is to demythicize its subject and show the forces that drove this man. Brilliant a tactician, merciless disciplinarian, a tireless fighter, prima donna, and staunch a patriot. Patton was all of these things and more. Life for him was the battlefield. And without war, his spirit was sapped. The German military recognized this when they noted that Berlin's fall would finish him. Patton was an anachronism, a man who belonged in another time. He was a warrior living in a time when victory in a battle no longer meant the triumph it once had. A Roman conqueror who understood the meaning of the words that all glory is fleeting. Above all, however, he was an icon whom millions cheered, millions hated, and few understood. One way you judge classic movies is by the parts that stick with you. By that measure, I've long regarded Patton as something of a mirage, a war movie about a personality and a larger-than-life actor who won the Oscar for bringing that personality to the screen, a picture of braver moments and yet a many-dollar command conferencia intrigues. Ask most people what they remember about this epic and they'll talk about the cussing, that opening pep talk in front of a gigantic American flag, a speech that apparently is based on what Third Army soldiers remembered of Patton's patented off-the-cuff get acquainted with the troops speech. Now, I want you to remember that no bastard ever won a war by dying for his country. He won it by making the other poor dumb bastard die for his country. It's a blustering, a sentimental, and patriotic rhapsody in a profanity. And when the movie was new in 1970, that speech set a tone that was jarringly out of step with the country souring and the Vietnam War. Cynical and more in the mood for ASH and Kelly's heroes than a John Wayne flog the wave that went out of its way not to cast John Wayne in the lead. For a war movie, there are maybe half a dozen combat scenes, most quite brief. But director Franklin Schaffner, Planet of the Apes, Papillon, Islands in the Stream, The Boys from Brazil, limited himself to one big desert set piece, a battle filled with real tanks, rally bombers, and fighters sweeping in low and a sea of extras dodging faked explosions under a sky littered with the pyrotechnics department airbursts. You remember the music, that jaunty, A Glorious March by Jerry Goldsmith. Thea titled the film Patton, Lust for Gloria in Britain to sort of soften the harsh portrait. The film paints of the brilliant British Papinge Bernard Law Montgomery. The moment we hear that march in its full gloriosa, Patton leads Third Army in a dash across France. The movie, and anybody who says it forgets all about Monty, the hero of Philemon, but towering over all of it in our memory is the eagle-beaked aggression of GeorgeCScott, one of the greatest screen actors this country has ever produced. A stunning presence so identified with the character that even historians have a hard time remembering what the Rella Patton looked or sounded like. If they were honest, Scott won the role after Roberta Mitchum, Lee Marvin, Burt Lancaster, and Rod Steiger were considered and approached over the years as 20th Century Fox chief Darryl F. Zanuck, a wee veteran who got himself into the thick of World War II action as an Army Signal Corps colonel, was eager to produce a combat epic to rival his big-budget all-star D-Day account, The Longest Day. What seems timeliest about this 1970 release at this moment in the middle of the latest attempt by Hollywood as screenwriters to get decent pay, compensation, commiserate with the many platforms their content now covers. Isa the writing. Francis Ford Coppola reworked material from many sources into a script that's mainly an eyewitness to a Patton view of the famous general. The structure brilliantly uses the familiar device of letting us see his foes view one of the man through the German officer Friedrich who researches and explains the Patton in German with subtitles to a general's Ramlin Jude Karl Michaela Vogler Richard Munch and the viewer. Coppola peppers the dialogue with the Pattonisms, profanity sprinkling quotations from famous generals and historians in French and Latin. He plays up Patton's erudite courtly side, his belief that he is reincarnated a soldier who has fought in many wars over the millennia, making it his destiny to lead a great army in the greatest war of all. The soldiers lay naked in the sun. 2,000 years ago I was here. The screenplay leans into the blood rivalry with Ramlin, finds fun in the equally bitter Buddha somehow playful one with Montgomery, who has been depicted in a few films, Buddha whose memory has been replaced by the appropriately clipped high-voiced barking of Michael Bates in this film. Coppola tapped into American Cold War, Vietnam War politics by reminding 1970 viewers of Patton's mistrust and disdain for the Russians. My compliments to the general. Please inform him that I do not care to drink with him or any other Russian son of Patton's book is a fetishizing of war as a human endeavor is meant to bathe some of the hero worship in blood, and it does. But America embraced Archie Bunker's intolerant form of patriotism as we laughed at it. Coppola has talked of being fired from this film, but when the finished product hit theaters, almost all of what was on the screen came from his pages, structure, research, and invention. And through it all, Scott bellows, swaggers, rages, and teases, all but devouring the screen, if never quite insecure enough to steal scenes from the likes of Oscar winner Carla Malden as the GI General Omar Bradley. You can't watch Patton and not be utterly consumed with the title character, which almost works against the film. Scott went on to other larger-than-life characters, a version of Hemingway in Islands in the Stream for a Shaner, the best American-born Scroogia, and Clive Donner's version of A Christmas Carol for TV. But Patton would overshadow them all. He'd even bring the character back for a less energetic Last Days of Patton TV movie years later, when TBS ran its Saturday AM series Movies for Guys Who Like Movies in the 80s and early 90s. Patton was on a regular rotation with Die Hard, Kelly's Heroes, and the Clint Eastwood Westerns, winner of 7 Academy Awards. It was one of the most honored films ever to make it into that Bush action to the program. And the reason isn't just Scott in it, isn't just the catchy Goldsmith score. Shaner's skilled direction of the footage shot by Fred J. Conemp and the brisk for 3-hour film editing by Hugh Fowler. It's the script started by a many hands crafted into something an actor at his best seething or in full bellow could sink his teeth into that makes the series of movie accidents a lust for glory that lasts. The opening moments of Franklin J. Schaffner's Patton to remain perhaps the most famous and is certainly its most commented on. A gigantic American flag fills the screen and hubbub fills the soundtrack. An off-screen voice calls 10 HUD and there is silence, then General George S. Patton GeorgeCScott strides Noah marches into view. He is far smaller in Schaffner's framing than we might expect for such a larger-than-a-life figure. Old Glory, though, is absurdly big, and many writers compare the effect to Pope art in its assertive simplicity. There's a bugle and a salute from Patton. Then, a medium-long shot of him is followed by a peculiar extreme close-up, which shows nearly all of his saluting hand. Only a quarter of his face. Perhaps these as an indication of how difficult it will be to get to know the man behind the soldier. Schaffner now cuts to Patton's other hand, gripping his swagger stick, and then we see his medals, his pistol, his helmet insignia, all the accoutrements of his military role. But still very little to us suggests there is anything here but a soldier. No emotion, no words until he begins his celebrated speech, delivered in real life, but rewritten for the film by Francis Ford Coppola and Edmund H. North. I want you to remember that no bastard ever won a war by dying for his country. He won it by making the other poor dumb bastard die for his country. The scene tells us everything we need to know, or does it? Certainly. It encapsulates one view of Patton. The forthright, uncompromising soldier dedicated to the pursuit of victory, and it has become so associated with Patton as indeed it has Scott's performance that when Joseph Sargent MacArthur 1977 opens with a flag and a speech from Gregory Peak as the titular general, or when Tom Cruise addresses his troops in front of the Stars and Stripes in Top Gun Maverick 2022. We're surely intended to think straight away of this moment, but if the Patton we see in this scene is supremely confident in his ability as in his rightness, Patton the movie is not, or at least not all the time. It would be utterly wrong to think of it as a revisionist or specifically anti-war, because it certainly is a celebration of the real Patton, but it would be equally wrong to see it as hagiography. While it is not overtly critical of Patton's worldview, it does not exclude the others either. Patton isn't unsympathetic, but nor is he quite sympathetic, let alone a conventional hero. He's driven, obsessive, and slightly weird. His misjudgments and the way that he was sidelined more than he would have liked in some of World War II's major military actions are in many ways the focus of the film more than his achievements. Patton may present its subject as a great man in some ways, but decidedly not in the sense of the great man theory of history. Given Patton's relatively large budget and its subject matter, audiences in 1970 might have expected another war epic like The Longest Day in 1962, and indeed 20th Century Fox's Neri Zanuck was instrumental in having both films made. But what they got was something much more like David Lean's Lawrence of Arabia in 1962, a movie where the lavish spectacle of war is there only as a context for a much more personal portrait of a complicated man. As with Lawrence, we are left with as many questions as answers. And as with Lawrence, an immensely long film, about 3 hours a piece, though Lawrence is slightly longer than Patton, is held together by one of the greatest biographical screen performances ever. After Patton's opening speech, the scene changes to Tunisia in 1943, and a defeat for the Allies. Dead men and animals litter the dust. A scorpion crawls over a scorched body by a burned-out vehicle. Scavengers roam. It's a far cry from the lofty exhortations of the speech. Are we already getting the sense that Patton's ideals and reality don't quite match up? And tellingly, the officer we now meet, contemplating the carnage, is not Patton himself, but General Omar N. Bradley, Karl Malden. He'll be the second most important character in the movie after Scott's Patton. Tellingly, too, after depicting Bradley at the battlefield, The film moves to showing Patton in Morocco, inspecting troops in a party address far from the front line, though he protests that "I'd prefer to be in Tunisia fighting the Germans." The Moroccan government minister, Albert Doum, presents Patton with a medal and remarks that the lions in their dens tremble at his approach, a comment which must be intended to come across as ironic to the viewer, even if not meant as such by the character. Given a command in North Africa, Patton soon asserts a strict discipline that will be one of his hallmarks and his eventual partial undoing. He also comes quite soon to develop a rivalry with the British general, later Field Marshal Bernard de Montgomery Michael Bates, which is possibly exacerbated by a more general Anglophobia and persists through the invasions of Sicily in 1943 and Francia in 1944. While this is vexatious for Patton, however, his career is more seriously derailed by an incident in 1943 where he slaps a soldier suffering from combative fatigue. In fact, there were two such incidents trimmed to one for the film. This and the subsequent apology that Patton is forced to make to his men are important turning points in the film's story elements to Patton's superiors. They were further evidence that he could be a loose cannon, and he was given some frustratingly minor assignments thereafter, but they are vital, too, in illuminating a central aspect of the character. In Patton's formative years, what later became known as shell shock and then combat fatigue, what today we call post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, had often been regarded simply as a cowardice. And although by the time of World War II, the U.S. military was far more enlightened on the subject, Patton is incapable of moving with the times. Battle fatigue, he says, is a free idea for yellow bellies. Just as with Lawrence, we have a strong sense that Patton is never really going to be happy because he's living in the wrong place and time. He believed quite literally in a reincarnation and that he had fought in battles of the past. The general's biographer Carlo D'Este in 1995 essay A Genius for War suggests that he saw himself as a modern version of the American Civil War's Confederates. Although Patton himself did not come from the South, one of his grandparents had been a Confederate colonel. He was fascinated by the idea of dying in a battle. Desk suggests it's one of the Germanic characters that appear briefly in the movie Captain Siegfried Rock describes him as a 16th century man. He is depicted by Schaffner and Scott as proud and ambitious, intolerant of weakness and excessively preoccupied with appearance, but he is not just the ramrod straight general of stereotype. He's insecure at the same time as being self-assured and emotional on occasions. In short, though he is highly intelligent and articulate, he is thoroughly out of place in the rational, technocratic, media army of the 20th century. The writers of Patton developed the general's character carefully through individual episodes revealing different facets of his nature, occasionally with a little humor. But a great deal of the credit for creating him must go to Scott in a performance that, as Dest points out, for many people has become the enduring image of the real Patton. Scott's face we think of when we see the general's name, Scott's growly delivery, and not Patton's rather high-pitched voice in which we imagine him speaking. Many others, including John Wayne and Burt Lancaster, had been offered the part, and Lancaster might have been pretty good at it, but it's difficult to believe anyone could have done better than Scott. It is surely his greatest screen performance and one he was mad for. Superficially, you might occasionally be reminded of the crazy general in Stanley Kubrick's Doctor Strangelove, 1964, but the character whom Scott's Patton really resembles is the strictly religious Midwestern father in Paul Schrader's Hardcore 1979. A complete fish out of water as he navigates the West Coast sex industry. He is nothing like Patton on paper of course, but his underlying responses to the situations in which he finds himself may not be so different, though nearly all attention goes to Scott. Malden, also billed above the title, delivers an almost equally fine performance of understated conviction. Very unfairly denigrated by some critics as Bradley, who is initially Patton's junior, who later promoted over him. and who is his utter opposite, quiet, bespectacled, a genial, devoid of braggadocio, even when he is being assertive, seemingly determined to make himself unobtrusive most of the time while Patton demands the limelight. Walden's Bradley is credible, hinting just to the right a degree at inner strengths. For all his seeming modesty, he is no pushover. Bradley also consulted on the film, which is partially based on the first of his two memoirs. Scott reprised his role for the made-for-TV sequel The Last Days of Patton 1986, rather disconcertingly because after the predictable opening flag the action takes place only months later, yet Scott of course is almost 2 decades older. This does in fact make him more or less the correct age to play the Patton of the immediate post-war period when Last Days is set. But his performance in the original Patton is so unforgettable that he seems far too old by comparison in the sequel. Ron Burglass, meanwhile, plays the much younger early 20th century Patton in flashback scenes, which seem rather like padding. First, The Last Days of Patton has some interest, concentrating. Patton won 7 Academy Awards, including the Best Picture accolade, as well as statuettes for Schaffner, for the screenwriters, and for Scott. Although Scott refused his Best Actor award, calling the Oscars a meat parade. I'd also won for art direction, editing, and sound, while Goldsmith was nominated for his music, Fred J. Conem for his cinematography, and Alex Weldon for special effects. In the U.S., it was the year's 4th highest-grossing film, slightly behind Robert Altman's Massa *H 1970, with which it was re-released a little later on a doubly bill. That combination may seem bizarre given the two films' wildly different approaches to the subjects of war and the army, but remarkably, Patton seemed to be appreciated by hawks and doves alike. Supporters of the military saw Patton as a hero. The anti-war, and there were plenty of them in 1970 with Vietnam raging, saw Schaffner's film as a confirmation of their worst fears about intransigence at the highest levels of command. One critic at the time, Ed Murphy of Variety, pinpointed the source of this appeal. Patton is one hell of a war picture, perhaps one of the most remarkable of its type ever made, which forges a daring and very successful path between cliché heroics and more contemporary put-down. Other critical views were more mixed. Vincent Canby of the New York Times found it consistently fascinating, but felt it idled Patton too much. Cale thought it simply kept out by not offering us enough information and on which to base a judgment of the character. Were his eccentricities and his high opinion of himself justified? Roger described it as one of the most uncluttered of war movies, devoid of side plots, colorful supporting characters and human interest. But he didn't see this as entirely positive. Unlike some of the critics, President Nixon was a huge fan, seeing Patton at least 6 times and no doubt identifying with the hard-done-by general as well as with the invocation of the Americana spirit. It would be no surprise if Patton resonated with President Trump, too. The very thought of losing is so hateful to Americans, says the general. This is one aspect of the film that can seem extremely hawkish, more so than other war movies, which tend to at least cursorily acknowledge the tragedy and destructiveness of war before they get on with the exciting blowing stuff up habits, or Patton's title character. It's all about winning. But Patton isn't necessarily saying that the general was right about this. The film is much less adulatory about Patton himself than the reputation might suggest. Sure, there's a little affection in the way he is presented, but nothing approaching unqualified praise. As Variety's Murphy observed, it's perfectly possible to see a Patton as a chronicle of flaws, if that's what you want to see. And is it a war movie in the normal sense at all anyway? Maybe not. Of course, war is the setting, but there is very little actual combat insofar as the war itself is the topic. Patton is more about strategy, and even more than that, it is about a personality. It is the story of a man who finds that the values of his world are changing around him and who's unwilling to change himself, but who still wants to make a difference on his own terms. Of the subtitles given to the movie for different releases, Lust for Glory sums it up better than Salute to a Rebel. If it were not based on a real person who happened to be a general, it could very easily be set just as effectively in a view of politics or business, for example. Is it an epic? It's certainly epic in a length, but again, the large-scale cast of 1,000 scenes are not the really important ones, and arguably, if Patton has a major flaw, it's that Schaffner and the writers haven't quite figured out how to combine these with a much smaller scale, more personal scene as where the real drama unfolds. But one thing it never is, not for a single moment, is boring. And on See Again, this has much more to do with its portrayal of Patton, the man, than with its depiction of war. Scott's magnetic performance, as well as Walden's sometimes underrated one, are the keys to the film's endless repeat value. It's aged far better than many films of its time, too. Perhaps because it was already set in the past and makes no overt attempt to draw parallels between the 1940s and 1970s, though again, they can be detected if you want them to be there. It still feels fresh. Schaffner's direction is occasionally flamboyant, also in that opening scene. Of course, but more often quietly competent, like Coppola's writing. Too much flashiness would get tiresome over 3 hours, and it isn't needed when Scott and the character he plays come across so powerfully in one of the most engrossing screen biographies ever made. Patton talks about following orders, doing what you are told, being pushed, becoming better. When you follow orders, you win. The strongest point the film makes is in favor of the institution, and Patton. Nothing is greater. The general respects it. He's just a bit of a rebel, but Isa his undoing. Is he right? Probably. But only in the most dangerous way. Turns the Nazi army round and fight the Russians with them. He accepts the consequences of his outspokenness as a good soldier should. And here we have the ultimate movie for 1970 and a cinematic sea change. The rebel who just might have known better than the politicians. But wouldn't quite go that far. Were this a film made in 1950, that would not be an extraordinary theme. For 1970, it is the most famous last stand against a pop culture revolution that irreversibly changed the arts and Americans' way of life. Patton, like its protagonist, was chosen by history, not the other way around. Cinematic and music historians will point to a time span, roughly 1965–75, where America noticeably changed. Some will suggest the JFK assassination, the Beatles, or even Elvis as the beginning. Others contend Watergate or the end of the draft or the election of Ronald Reagan were the true end. This was no statistical change but an emotional one. How we felt about things. Patton, according to the Internet Movie Database, opened nationally April 2, 1970. What was sayable, showable, allowable in the years around its release was changing forever. Observers will point to 1967 as sort of the beginning of New Hollywood, ushered in by Bonnie and Clyde and others. Patton was a revival of old school, a tribute to those pining for America's past in the midst of a turbulent, irreverent present. Almost every film that has followed, as well as some beforehand, smashes those barriers. Examples too countless to list. The Hollywood landscape, but consider some notable Oscar entries. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, The Institution leading to failure. All the President's Men Can't Trust the Folks at the Top. The Deer Hunter, Apocalypse Now and a Platoon. No Glory in War, Only Hell. A Few Good Men. The Military is Corrupt, and Forgiven. There's serious ambiguity between right and wrong. Good Will Hunting. People should not be pushed but nurtured. Patton defies those notions but is more sympathetic than it lets on. In the end, we have to obey authority. But in rebellion, there is glory. According to the IMDb, Patton was known internationally by assorted other titles, including Patton Trebellina Uniform, Patton, A Salute to Herbal Patent, Salute to Glory, Rebellion Make Us, and the movie far more than a conventional biopic. Patton succeeds where many other lauded efforts, Ray, Walk the Line, Avianaut. This movie is about a larger-than-life character in one particular field of military service that would soon cease to produce any more larger-than-life characters. This is not about a successful leader in a successful campaign. This is about the end of the generalissimo, an archetype that had dominated human civilization since its inception. Patton is the perfect individual to deliver this story. It can and should be noted that Douglas MacArthur is an even a stronger candidate. He was fired by the president several years after Patton had died. He famously declared in war there is no substitute for victory. But Patton believed in reincarnation and saw himself as the continuation of a long line of noble warriors. He speaks of ancient battle sites as though he were there because he believes that he was. Thus, we have a protagonist who not only ideally represents the archetype but is well aware that he does. Those of us who grew up after Korea or at least after Vietnam have never witnessed a pattern and never will. Today's military operations by the major world powers area generally fought not over survival but sanctions, principles, Geneva Conventions, international rules and guidelines, and so those who run them at the top area generally bureaucrats, technocrats, diplomats, even on some level of humanitarians who must meet a rapidly increasing moral sensitivity criteria in each engagement. Patton, like great conquerors of centuries, past fights for survival and glory, but more of the former than the latter, as he eloquently declares in his powerful final statement. He casually walks through active battlefields well before the Kilgore of Apocalypse. Now he carries a pistol and uses it and wears black gloves. Probably the second most famous movie character to wear black gloves after Darth Vader. In private, we see another Patton, a scholarly type with hooded glasses who designs his own appealing uniforms. He prays on his knees and reads the Bible every day. There is a statement being made in Patton's hospitality. The movie opens at the site of an American defeat in Morocco, and Patton's quarters are sparse and lightly defended as is realized when German planes strafed at the building during dinner. Gradually as he begins rigging up victories and advancing through Sicily, Patton's headquarters come to resemble a palace up until his ouster as 7th Army Chief. Everywhere he goes, the local reaction for him is enormous. The liberator has arrived and the people adore him. Despite the ugliness of war, Patton's world is bright. The sun shines on North Africa and Sicily. Even as the bombs fall, this is a gladiator on the path to glory. The battle scenes are not extraordinary and not nearly gritty enough for today's audience. The typical wounded soldier has a bandage around his head. This is a tough business, but these are winners. Patton in several ways connects with his foot soldiers. But clearly there is hubris. He surrounds himself with aides who shower him with praise. When his commander objects to his plans, he warns them they can either obey or be replaced. The conflict in Patton is not so much with the Axis powers, but with his own rivals among the Allies for publicity. It is strongly implied that Patton makes important decisions to serve his own propaganda interests rather than the best interests of the Allies. But it is also strongly implied that bureaucracy risks undermining the American cause, that too many significant favors are granted to Montgomery and later the Russians to avoid ruffling feathers. Patton is doing the right thing for the wrong reasons. Patton reminds us, as does Shane, of an advanced society's tenuous relationship with warriors. Shane is needed to safeguard a community that does not welcome gunfighters. Patton is needed to win the world war by a society that will not let him slap his soldiers by leaders and civilians who themselves may not be capable of ordering thousands of young men into a dangerous but necessary battle zone as with a clear conscience, knowing many of them are never going home. Carl Malden's depiction of Omar Bradley is one of the all-time great supporting roles. Here Isa the technocrat. Highly competent, playing it by the book, the understudy to the warrior. And as America's military role in the world evolves rapidly between 1941 and 1945, he is the one who emerges most in demand, a consensus builder who will fight based on the rapidly evolving modern standards. At one point, he tells Patton, "I do this because I've been trained to do it." "You do it because you will love it," a friend insists. Patton has a serious problem in that the best part is the first 5 minutes. He has a point, only I can just imagine the troops listening to the general before an incursion, perhaps a D-Day, chills running down their spines. But the intro is not a pep talk. It's more like a worldview. Winners die but they do not sacrifice. The goal and satisfaction is not to fight but to win. Those captivated by the opening scene might assume Patton the motivated soldiers through great speeches. In fact, his speech was not considered great, and what the movie gradually illustrates beautifully is the success of relentless pushing, how human beings ironically accomplish greater things when they don't necessarily want it to. We see armies that are forced to advance with no sleep against a ruthless opposition. Even during relaxed moments after victories, they are disciplined if they stray from extremely rigorous eating schedules or dress codes. There is a natural human reaction to rebel against such directives that are considered unusual. Few are happy to be told by their boss that they must work an extra half hour every night to perform another task. What does not occur to them initially and may never occur to them at all is how this extra effort makes them better employees and their companies stronger. Bosses who make such demands take a risk if they are ineffective leaders. They are hated and seen as sadistic. An opposing example exists in Good Will Hunting, the Matt Damon vehicle that I also reviewed on this site. In Hunting, two professors nearly come to blows over whether a young genius should be pushed to expand his intelligence capabilities. The two films are a fascinating study in contrasts and generations. People in general, Patton's world would look down on Will, a massive underachiever dependent on fragile psychotherapy. The viewpoint of Hunting is that life's abuses cause deep-rooted harm, that they cannot or should not be shrugged off for the sake of objective goals. In his opening speech, Patton tells his troops, 30 years from now, when you're sitting around your fireside with your grandson on your knee and he asks you, "What did you do in the Great World War II?" you won't have to say, "Well, one shoveled in Louisiana." What did General George Patton do? The standard answer is defeated the Nazis in Africa and Europe. But the deeper answer is some of the toughest, most effective military campaigns ever experienced. Just as we see Patton's relentless drive outperforming his peers and more importantly defeating the German army, we see the evolving standards of Western society eclipsing Patton. The greatest warrior of the European theater is defeating history's most legendary opponent, the Nazis, but is not letting the charge into Berlin. That assignment is gradually handed to more methodical standardized figures, Bradley and Eisenhower. The interest in Patton's services wanes the closer he gets to the capital. After the guns are silenced, he is deemed an outright liability, a serious risk to the newfound, highly uncertain balance of power in the world. A little of that can be shown well visually, specifically his standoffishness at the Soviet dance. But it's an otherwise difficult concept to illustrate, so the movie relies on all face-to-face chats and messages. Thea will not send him to the Pacific, where an epic struggle still rages, and so he knows his day is over, that he has likely fought in history's last conventional world war and incredibly dies just a few months later after a routine traffic accident in which his fellow passengers were unhurt and the Jeep itself was repaired and reused. Patton was media at the height of American involvement in the Vietnam War and was probably applauded by those of pro-military sentiment disheartened by the backlash during Vietnam. In the years following the Vietnam War, Cinema has reimbursed the war hero in pictures such as Saving a Private Ryan and Letters from Iwo Jima, although those films in the modern genre also carry profound social and humanitarian concerns rarely evident in Patton. The general declares in his stunning closing line, "Glory is fleeting." It is stunning not just for its accuracy but misperception. Patton of all people underestimates the magnitude of the victory his soldiers produced. They did not wear neckties and go sleepless to deliver a conqueror to the streets of Europe. They did it to deliver from tyranny a safe free Europe and beyond, whose glory is very much appreciated today. It wasn't a conventional war film. Francis Ford Coppola understates early in the new commentary track on this 2-disc edition, the third and best DVD release of Patton 1978. At around age 27 he tells us he was the Fox biopic's original screenwriter. His goal to portray the essence of an unconventional controversial World War II general as a model for those who choose to see that kind of hawkish military man as a kind of hero, but that was only half of it. Simultaneously, for moviegoers on the left side of the aisle, he aimed to depict Patton as a complex tragic figure, a Don Quixote tilting at windmills at a time when warriors and warriors' values were no longer quite treasured. But Coppola's audacious opening scene with pistola packing, rough-talking General George S. Patton addressing the audience's thought they were troops backdropped by a vast American flag was deemed so strange that Coppola says he was fired from the project. The film itself was to all appearances abandoned. Years later in 1971 Coppola was close to getting fired again, at this time as The Godfather's director. However, as chance would have it, Patton, which had been restarted and shot without him, had just taken 7 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Screenplay. Although years had passed since he turned in his initial rejected script, there on that year's Oscar sweeper glowed his byline, shared with Edmund H. North, who worked directly with the production. After that, what studio could fire him and not look foolish in a Variety? It's a resurrection story that he credits for saving his professional bacon and win for The Godfather as we know it now. His commentary track here won't go on anyone's list of great audio excesses. It's intermittent and repetitive, and his assumed audience seems to be all you young people in a film 101 class. After 40 years, this 5-time Oscar-winning director, producer, and a screenwriter is parent proud that so many of his early contributions, most famously the opening scene, survived in Patton. That byline story sparks a theme he returns to occasionally. His hindsight at 67 into how much we are shaped by serendipity and happenstance. It's a preant theme. Younger Coppola wove into this epic-sized portrait of a man who believed himself fated to shape battlefields and therefore history. Of course, what's most memorable about Patton is GeorgeCScott's film, So Be It. George Patton was born at least once for these big screen dimensions. By the end of the movie, you may hate the half-crazed son of a but you can't not admire him. And in Scott, we get a rare example of a Best Actor Oscar win that's unassailable. Well, unassailable except to Scott himself, because he considered actors competing against one another unseemly. He refused the Oscar. During the ceremony, he stayed home and watched a hockey game. If Fox had not fired that audacious young Coppola and backburnered Patton for a while, it's likely that the role would have gone to the studio's original choice, Burt Lancaster. A serendipity and happenstance. Release it at the height of an unpopular war in Vietnam. Patton is a powerful cinematic contemplation on the incredible, albeit a controversial legacy of General George S. Patton. The script was written by Francis Ford Coppola and Edmund H. North, based on Patton's Ordeal and Triumph by Alahaz Farago and General Bradley's memoir entitled A Soldier's Story. GeorgeCScott delivers one of the great performances in all of Hollywood history as General George S. Patton, old blood and guts, the gruff recalcitrant, disciplined, well-read, profane yet a virtuous Allied leader. Apparently, the role was offered to numerous other leading men such as Burt Lancaster, a Rod Stager, Lee Marvin, Robert Mitchum, and John Wayne. But it is impossible to imagine anyone else besides George C. Scott filling these shoes. Scott was a billowing tower of a man, a drinker, a Shakespearean actor who treaded uncomfortably through the circles of Hollywood, and so he predictably refused to attend the Academy Awards ceremony in which Patton won him Best Actor as well as the coveted Best Picture award. He refused to accept the award on philosophical grounds. There are so many famous scenes in this movie, images of a triumphant war hero to a dejected aging veteran. The most famous shot is the opening scene, which features General Patton addressing an unspecified band of American troops before a giant Americana flag. Though there are many other classic scenes, one that comes to mind occurs during an unexpected German airstrike which finds General Patton hopping out a window and firing a pistol at the oncoming planes overhead. We realize Patton is a reckless, intrepid maverick, a feverish jingoist whose unbreakable strength is only paralleled in his candor and his callousness. Ida begins in North Africa in Tunisia in 1943. The American troops of two corps area demoralized after a devastating loss to the German leader Erwin Rommel-Kasserine. The Allied command looks to General Patton to restore discipline in order to secure victory, and that is exactly what he does. When Patton arrives, he immediately whips the troops into shape, starting with a rigid dress code. Then he secures a decisive victory in a battle of tank warfare in North Africa, proudly declaring to Rommel, "I read your book." Next, we see the invasion of Sicily. In a nod to the Hussites and the infamous Sicilian expedition from classical antiquity, Patton proposes a plan wherein Patton's British counterpart captures Syracuse while Patton cuts off the enemy inland Ottomasi. The plan is scrapped by General Eisenhower, who instead favors a more steady, cautious approach. However, Patton grows impatient and defying orders. He marches his troops through Sicily anyway, capturing both Palermo and Mzine, comparing himself to the Greeks, Romans, Persians, Byzantines, Arabs, and so on who came before him. Patton's stunt withers his trust with the Central Command despite the fact that he was correct in his assessment. In addition, Patton faces another scandal when he is forced to apologize for his uncouth behavior. While in Italy, he makes an infamous visit to a hospital where he encounters a soldier suffering from battle fatigue, or what we might call today PTSD. Instead of supporting the soldier, Patton publicly berates him, slaps him, calls him a coward, and demands that he be immediately relocated to the front line. In truth, there were actually two such incidents, and they plagued Patton for the rest of his life. Throughout the film, his erratic nature is what allows for his success, but it also leads to his downfall. When Eisenhower announces an invasion of Normandy, Bradley is placed in command instead of Patton. He lamentably lost his good standing among the generals. Patton's flaw is that he is not a political man like his foil General Bradley. Your worst enemy is your own big mouth. He is too ensconced in the young warrior spirit, and his vibrant is contrasted with the cold bureaucracy of the military. In the rigid chain of command, the soldier diplomat reigns over the reckless untamed conqueror. However, both types are mutually dependent upon one another. Patton is hated by his troops but loved for his victories. His persona is compared to the relics of warriors post Ajax, the Mysticals, Alexander the Great, Scipio, Caesar, Henry V, Napoleon, and so on. In fact, Patton did truly believe he was the living reincarnation of great historical warriors from antiquity. He was apparently quite a superstitious man. At any rate, at the invasion of Normandy, Patton is placed in charge of a decoy British cohort intended to distract the Germans. Patton stumbles into another controversy when he claims the future post-war order will be dominated by the United States and Great Britain, neglecting to mention the Soviet Union, then allied with the USA and Great Britain. After D-Day, Patton is given command of the Third Army, which plows through France, liberates Belgium, and performing the daring, A record-breaking rescue of the 101st Airborne Division trapped at Patton. He then continues onward, invading Germany, but his controversies continue. In the end, we see the graying general walking his dog, reflecting on warfare in ancient Roman, musing that all gloria is fleeting. While we are given glimpses of his many controversies, and some have noted some minor historical inaccuracies, that is, the real Patton had a much higher, squeakier voice than a GeorgeCScott. However, for a 3-hour film, Patton covers a perfectly suited balance of warfare and a quiet reflection, just enough for the audience to admire yet disdain the man. The film offers a strategically ambiguous stance on the controversial legacy of Patton. It is often accused of either being extremely hawkish in a glorification of war, and yet it is also chastised for being written by doves, afraid to showcase the true greatness of General Patton. In fact, I was reminded of Xenophon, the great warrior and writer from ancient Greece. In particular, his magnificent adventure, the emphasis of Cyrus is contrasted with his aging life of an honored veteran in Sparta. Elsewhere in the Helicopan considers what rare qualities must be present in a man who is capable of successfully commanding thousands. Surely George S. Patton was the embodiment of that man. General George S. Patton was one of the U.S. top brass during the Second World War, serving in North Africa and on the Western Front. Outspoken and always controversial, he inspired either intense loyalty or abject loathing. The real General Patton was quite a card, an obsessive military historia junkie who believed fervently in a Christian God and simultaneously in a reincarnation. He loved war and killing with a passion that quite often tipped over into the distasteful. He was obsessed with the tiniest details of turnout, losing his rag if a soldier had untied shoelaces or 5:0 shadow. GeorgeCScott gives one of the all-time great screen performances in the title role, making the crazy old Aku almost sympathetic without softening any of his rough edges. Only a thing he does soften is the voice. That's understandable. Had he imitated the real Patton's Mickey Mouse squeak, it would have been impossible to take the movie seriously. The screenplay by Francis Ford Coppola and Edmund H. North is terrific, capturing Patton's flights of classical erudition just as convincingly as his tireless cussing. Often the words used are actually Patton's own, though they have toned down some of the swearing. Patton himself would never have stood fornication when there was another F-word so readily to hand. Even in the imaginary opening sequence when Patton the pep talks straight to camera in front of colossal stars and stripes, much of the dialogue is accurate. Americans love to fight, he barks. That's why Americans have never lost and will never lose a war. Yes, well, this isn't real future. It's true that a lot of the military props, notably the tanks, are inaccurate models. However, these are more than compensated for by the energy of the film's battle sequences, including one where Patton gets his own revolvers out and starts firing at low-flying Luftwaffe planes. Asked by a reporter about this famous pair of pearl-handled guns, Patton growls, they're ivory. Only a pimp from a cheap New Orleans house would carry a pearl-handled pistol. In a momentary departure from the truth, Patton is desperate to make it through Sicily to Messina before the British General Montgomery. On his way, he visits a field hospital. Among the casualties is a young man who appears to be suffering from a nervous breakdown. Patton flies into a rage. "You're just a goddamn coward," whacks sobbing a soldier on the head with his leather gloves. "Won't have a yellow bastard sitting here crying in front of the brave men who've been wounded in battles." "Shut up, whack, send him up to the front." Unfortunately, this is a pretty accurate depiction of a real scene, and as in the movie, it nearly ended Patton's career. What is not to mention here is that the supposedly shell-shocked soldier, Charles Cole, turned out to have been suffering from malaria. In the film, Patton's apology is shown to be grudging. In real life, he was genuinely remorseful. After the scandal, Patton is reduced to conducting military history tours, quite good ones, for fellow soldiers in Malta and hanging around in a chintzy flat in London to confuse the Nazis. Finally, at the helm of the Third Army, he leads the troops into battle to relieve the Owen's airborne who are encircled at Baston. All accurate enough, though the verdict of one Nazi on this American general is not, the absence of war will kill him. Though Patton did die soon after the war, it was from the more mundane cause of injuries sustained during a car accident. It bends a few facts and occasionally slips towards satire, but for the most part, this is a remarkably enjoyable and commendably a fair biopic of an unforgettably character. They don't make many films or indeed generals like this anymore. His first battle pits his troops against the famous German tank commander Werner Rommel's Afrika Korps. Following the victory at Prin, Patton gives a high-level formal dinner to promote his plans for invading Sicily. He wants to land his troops at Palermo, a city on the northwest corner of the island, then a drive to Messina, the gateway to Italy located at the northeast of Sicily, while British Field Marshal Bernard de Montgomery invades Syracuse in the south and drives northward to Messina. By doing this, Patton's troops would cut off the escape route of the Germans. Patton's plan was nixed by the Allied High Command and he was ordered to protect Monti's left flank on the mountainous road to Messina. Patton ignored the order, drove his troops to victory at Palermo, then beat Monti to Messina. This was the beginning of the war of egos between the commanders that would last throughout the war. Patton 1970. During his march to Messina, Patton entered an army hospital to console the wounded and came across a soldier suffering from battle fatigue. Patton became enraged, slapped the soldier, and threatened to shoot him, then ordered him to be sent to the front lines. The incident caused Patton to be subjugated to a decoy while the command of the American forces in Europe was given to Bradley. The decoy ploy worked also. Germany scattered its troops to counteract Patton's movements. The ruse was especially effective during the Allied invasion of Normandy D-Day. After the D-Day invasion, Patton was given a command of the Third Army, which cut a swift path across France toward German soil, but was redirected northward to thwart the last desperate advance by the Germans, commonly known as the Battle of the Bulge. Patton, 1970. The film was released in 1970 during the height of the protest movement of the Vietnam War. It reminded the public of a time when Americans were proud of their involvement in military actions. Patton, released during the height of the Vietnam War, successfully had either both ways. It could be appreciated by hawks as a celebration of Patton's encouraging battlefield genius and also by doves as an exposure of his failings. Wilmington, 2002. The film was essentially accurate in its depiction of historical events, but a couple of aspects stood out as inaccurate, such as Patton's speech to his troops in which he apologized for the slapping incident. While he was indeed ordered to do so by later Commander Dwight Eisenhower, and to gather those under his command for the apology, in reality, his troops cheered for long and so loud at his arrival. He was never able to deliver this speech as the film depicted. Those words on the balcony were never spoken. The movie showed his blatant disregard for American casualties in favor of Victoria at any cost, which is fictional, as the casualty rates were among the lowest in the European theater. Patton was neither cold nor insensitive. He cared deeply about those under his command who stood in the face of enemy fire and refused to yield. Bardini Nelli, 1994. One can learn a brief overview of the war and the integral part that Patton's armies played in the liberation of Europe and defeat of Germany, as it was based on for the most part historical events. Patton is a mini-history lesson of the war in Europe. A United States Army general finds his path to glory a difficult and contentious one. Also, director Franklin J. Schaffner explores the life of real-life General George S. Patton. The film, taking its title from the famed general's last name, is also conventional a war film, as you can imagine. Interspersed in the biopic framework are scenes of battle and the resultant carnage. However, The blend of biopic and war film is an interesting approach that ends up rewarding the viewer with an film. So be it. George Patton was born at least once for these big screen dimensions. By the end of the movie, you may hate how the half-crazed son of a but you can't not admire him. And in Scott, we get a rare example of a Best Actor Oscar win that's unassailable. Well, unassailable except to Scott himself, because he considered actors competing against one another unseemly. He refused the Oscar. During the ceremony, he stayed home and watched a hockey game. If Fox had not fired that audacious young Coppola and backburnered Patton for a while, it's likely that the role would have gone to the studio's original choice, Burt Lancaster. A serendipity and happenstance. Release it at the height of an unpopular war in Vietnam. Patton is a powerful cinematic contemplation on the incredible, albeit a controversial legacy of General George S. Patton. The script was written by Francis Ford Coppola and Edmund H. North, based on Patton's ordeal and triumph by Allah's Farrago and General Bradley's memoir entitled A Soldier's Story. GeorgeCScott delivers one of the great performances in all of Hollywood history as General George S. Patton, old blood and guts, the gruff recalcitrant, disciplined, well-read, profane yet a virtuous Allied leader. Apparently, the role was offered to numerous other leading men such as Burt Lancaster, A. Rod Steiger, Lee Marvin, Robert Mitchum, and John Wayne. But it is impossible to imagine anyone else besides George C. Scott filling these shoes. Scott was a billowing tower of a man, a drinker, a Shakespearean actor who treaded uncomfortably through the circles of Hollywood, and so he predictably refused to attend the Academy Awards ceremony in which Patton won him Best Actor as well as the coveted Best Picture award. He refused to accept the award on philosophical grounds. There are so many famous scenes in this movie. Images of a triumphant war hero to a dejected aging veteran. The most famous shot is the opening scene, which features General Patton addressing an unspecified band of American troops before a giant American flag. Though there are many other classic scenes, one that comes to mind occurs during an unexpected German airstrike which finds General Patton hopping out a window and firing a pistol at the oncoming planes overhead. We realize Patton is a reckless, intrepid maverick, a feverish jingoist whose unbreakable strength is only paralleled in his candor and his callousness. Ida begins in North Africa in Tunisia in 1943. The American troops of two corps area demoralized after a devastating loss to the German leader Erwin Rommel at Kasserine. The Allied command looks to General Patton to restore discipline in order to secure victory, and that is exactly what he does. When Patton arrives, he immediately whips the troops into shape, starting with a rigid dress code. Then he secures a decisive victory in a battle of tank warfare in North Africa, proudly declaring to Rommel, "I read your book." Next, we see the invasion of Sicily, in a nod to the Hussites and the infamous Sicilian expedition from classical antiquity. Patton proposes a plan wherein Patton's British counterpart captures Syracuse while Patton cuts off the enemy inland Mossy. The plan is scrapped by General Eisenhower, who instead favors a more steady, cautious approach. However, Patton grows impatient and defying orders. He marches his troops through Sicily anyway, capturing both Palermo and Messina, comparing himself to the Greeks, Romans, Persians, Byzantines, Arabs, and so on who came before him. Patton's stunt withers his trust with the Central Command despite the fact that he was correct in his assessment. In addition, Patton faces another scandal when he is forced to apologize for his uncouth behavior. While in Italy, he makes an infamous visit to a hospital where he encounters a soldier suffering from battle fatigue, or what we might call today PTSD. Instead of supporting the soldier, Patton publicly berates him, slaps him, calls him a coward, and demands that he be immediately relocated to the front line. In truth, there were actually two such incidents, and they plagued Patton for the rest of his life. Throughout the film, his erratic nature is what allows for his success, but it also leads to his downfall. When Eisenhower announced an invasion of Normandy, Bradley Isa placed in command instead of Patton. He lamentably lost his good standing among the generals. Patton's flaw is that he is not a political man like his foil General Bradley. Your worst enemy Isa your own big mouth. He is too ensconced in the young warrior spirit, and his de vibra is contrasted with the cold bureaucracy of the military. In the rigid chain of command, the soldier diplomat reigns over the reckless untamed conqueror. However, both types are mutually dependent upon one another. Patton is hated by his troops but loved for his victories. His persona is compared to the relics of warriors post Ajax, the Mysticals, Alexander the Great, Scipio, Caesar, Henry V, Napoleon, and so on. In fact, Patton did truly believe he was the living reincarnation of great historical warriors from antiquity. He was apparently quite a superstitious man. At any rate, at the invasion of Normandy, Patton is placed in charge of a decoy British cohort intended to distract the Germans. Patton stumbles into another controversy when he claims the future post-war order will be dominated by the United States and Great Britain, neglecting to mention the Soviet Union, then allied with the USA and Great Britain. After D-Day, Patton is given command of the Third Army, which plows through France, liberates Belgium, and performing the daring, record-breaking rescue of the 101st Airborne Division trapped at Baston. He then continues onward, invading Germany, but his controversies continue. In the end, we see the graying general walking his dog, reflecting on warfare in ancient Roman, musing that all glory is fleeting. While we are given glimpses of his many controversies, and some have noted some minor historical inaccuracies, that is, the real Patton had a much higher, squeakier voice than a GeorgeCScott. However, for a 3-hour film, Patton covers a perfectly suited balance of warfare and a quiet reflection, just enough for the audience to admire yet disdain the man. The film offers a strategically ambiguous stance on the controversial legacy of Patton. It is often accused of either being extremely hawkish in a glorification of war, and yet it is also chastised for being written by doves, afraid to showcase the true greatness of General Patton. In fact, I was reminded of Xenophon, the great warrior and writer from ancient Greece. In particular, his magnificent adventure, the emphasis of Cyrus is contrasted with his aging life of an honored veteran in Sparta. Elsewhere in the Helicopan considers what rare qualities must be present in a man who is capable of successfully commanding thousands. Surely George S. Patton was the embodiment of that man. General George S. Patton was one of the U.S. top brass during the Second World War, serving in North Africa and on the Western Front. Outspoken and always controversial, he inspired either intense loyalty or abject loathing. The real General Patton was quite a card, an obsessive military historia junkie who believed fervently in a Christian God and simultaneously in a reincarnation. He loved war and killing with a passion that quite often tipped over into the distasteful. He was obsessed with the tiniest details of turnout, losing his rag if a soldier had untied shoelaces or 5:0 shadow. GeorgeCScott gives one of the all-time great screen performances in the title role, making the crazy old Aku almost sympathetic without softening any of his rough edges. Only a thing he does soften is the voice, that's understandable. Had he imitated the real Patton's Mickey Mouse squeak, it would have been impossible to take the movie seriously. The screenplay by Francis Ford Coppola and Edmund H. North is terrific, capturing Patton's flights of classical erudition just as convincingly as his tireless cussing. Often the words used are actually Patton's own, though they have toned down some of the swearing. Patton himself would never have stood fornication when there was another F-word so readily to hand. Even in the imaginary opening sequence when Patton pep talks straight to camera in front of colossal stars and stripes, much of the dialogue is accurate. Americans love to fight, he barks. That's why Americans have never lost and will never lose a war. Yes, Well, this isn't real future. It's true that a lot of the military props, notably the tanks, are inaccurate models. However, these are more than compensated for by the energy of the film's battle sequences, including one where Patton gets his only revolvers out and starts firing at low-flying Luftwaffe planes. Asked by a reporter about this famous pearl-handled guns, Patton growls, they're ivory. Only a pimp from a cheap New Orleans house would carry a pearl-handled pistol. In a momentary departure from the truth, Patton is desperate to make it through Sicily to Messina before the British General Montgomery. On his way, he visits a field hospital. Among the casualties is a young man who appears to be suffering from a nervous breakdown. Patton flies into a rage. "You're just a goddamn coward," whacks sobbing a soldier on the head with his leather gloves. "Won't have a yellow bastard is sitting here crying in front of 30 brave men who've been wounded in the battles." "Shut up, whack, send him up to the front." Unfortunately, this is a pretty accurate depiction of a real scene, and as in the movie, it nearly ended Patton's career. What is not to mention here is that the supposedly shell-shocked soldier, Charles Cole, turned out to have been suffering from malaria. In the film, Patton's apology is shown to be grudging. In real life, he was genuinely remorseful. After the scandal, Patton is reduced to conducting military history tours, quite good ones, for fellow soldiers in Malta and hanging around in a chintzy flat in London to confuse the Nazis. Finally, at the helm of the Third Army, he leads the troops into battle to relieve the 101st Airborne who are encircled at Baston. All accurate enough, though the verdict of one Nazi on this American general is not, the absence of war will kill him. Though Patton did die soon after the war, it was from the more mundane cause of injuries sustained during a car accident. It bends a few facts and occasionally slips towards satire, but for the most part, this is a remarkably enjoyable and commendably a fair biopic of an unforgettably character. They don't make many films or indeed generals like this anymore. His first battle pits his troops against the famous German tank commander Werner Rommel's Afrika Korps. Following the victory at Krin, Patton gives a high-level formal dinner to promote his plans for invading Sicily. He wants to land his troops at Palermo, a city on the northwest corner of the island, then drive to Messina, the gateway to Italy located at the northeast of Sicily, while British Field Marshal Bernard de Montgomery invades Syracuse in the south and drives northward to Messina. By doing this, Patton's troops would cut off the escape route of the Germans. Patton's plan was nixed by the Allied High Command and he was ordered to protect Monty's left flank on the mountainous road to Messina. Patton ignored the order, drove his troops to victory at Palermo, then beat Monty to Messina. This was the beginning of the war of egos between the commanders that would last throughout the war. Patton 1970. During his march to Messina, Patton entered an army hospital to console the wounded and came across a soldier suffering from battle fatigue. Patton became enraged, slapped the soldier, and threatened to shoot him, then ordered him to be sent to the front lines. The incident caused Patton to be subjugated to a decoy while the command of the American forces in Europe was given to Bradley. The decoy ploy worked also. Germany scattered its troops to counteract Patton's movements. The ruse was especially effective during the Allied invasion of Normandy D-Day. After the D-Day invasion, Patton was given a command of the Third Army, which cut a swift path across France toward German soil, but was redirected northward to thwart the last desperate advance by the Germans, commonly known as the Battle of the Bulge. Patton, 1970. The film was released in 1970 during the height of the protest movement of the Vietnam War. It reminded the public of a time when Americans were proud of their involvement in military actions. Patton, released during the height of the Vietnam War, successfully had either both ways. It could be appreciated by hawks as a celebration of Patton's encouraging battlefield genius and also by doves as an exposure of his failings. Wilmington, 2002. The film was essentially accurate in its depiction of historical events, but a couple of aspects stood out as inaccurate, such as Patton's speech to his troops in which he apologized for the slapping incident, while he was indeed ordered to do so by later Commander Dwight Eisenhower, and to gather those under his command for the apology. In reality, his troops cheered for long and so loud at his arrival. He was never able to deliver this speech as the film depicted. Those words on the balcony were never spoken. The movie showed his blatant disregard for American casualties in favor of Victoria at any cost, which is fictional, as the casualty rates were among the lowest in the European theater. Patton was neither cold nor insensitive. He cared deeply about those under his command who stood in the face of enemy fire and refused to yield. Bardini Nelli, 1994. One can learn a brief overview of the war and the integral part that Patton's armies played in the liberation of Europe and defeat of Germany, as it was based on for the most part historical events. Patton is a mini-history lesson of the war in Europe. A United States Army general finds his path to glory a difficult and contentious one as the director Franklin J. Schaffner explores the life of real-life General George S. Patton. The film, taking its title from the famed general's last name, is also conventional a war film as you can imagine. Interspersed in the biopic framework are scenes of battle and the resultant carnage. However, the blend of a biopic and war film is an interesting approach that ends up rewarding the viewer with an